Ray, should we start by talking about something I know you've done a lot of work on over your career, which is the biological causes of male homosexuality, and specifically this question about birth order effect, which I think lots of listeners will probably be familiar with, this idea that the more older brothers you have, the more likely you are as a man to be gay. Could you explain what's going on there?
There's actually a lot of research which started back in the 1930s in Germany and has continued fitfully on and off. I made it a kind of topic of interest of myself and did a lot of work on it. The earlier research, including, let's say, the last 20 years, 30 years of research, provided a lot of evidence that older brothers increase the odds of homosexuality in later born males. And this looked like a pretty stable finding until the past couple of years, which suggested that, in fact, older sisters also have an effect on later born males, and that as far as lesbians go, which I always thought were completely irrelevant to this phenomenon, that number of older siblings also has an effect on lesbians. So the initial finding, which was that it only matters for older brothers and it only has an effect on younger brothers, that might have been a little too restrictive, and it might in fact be a birth order effect that in which females are both causal and affected, whereas, as I said, that's only been the past few years.
What do you think is the most plausible explanation as to why this might happen? It must, I guess, have something to do with the environment in utero?
That's my hypothesis. One of the reasons that I think it has to do with the uterine environment is that purely genetic effects that are 100% genetic, do not show birth order effects. So, purely genetic phenomena are like rolling a dice. What you get on this toss of the dice does not affect what you get on the next toss of the dice. So although I never ever denied that genes have an effect on sexual orientation, or perhaps hormonal abnormalities for that matter, my point has always been that these are not the only biological phenomena that can affect sexual orientation. And in fact, that point is made pretty clearly just by studies of identical twins who do have a much higher concordance rate of both being homosexual than brothers or sisters who are not identical twins, but it's still very, very hard from 100% concordance. So the twin data alone show that genes per se cannot account completely for sexual orientation. On the other hand, the immune system, which is all about memory, is a very feasible mechanism for the mother clocking down how many fetuses she's previously carried and perhaps responding in such a way that would affect the next fetus, the next fetus that she carries. So that's why I think that if you look at the different biological mechanisms that are plausible explanations, that a fetal-maternal immune interaction looks like a much better fit to the data than a purely genetic explanation.
And I presume that maternal age and paternal age are not the causes. That's all being controlled for. It's specifically the birth order.
I controlled for maternal age in my studies, and it wasn't maternal. That was what people initially thought. The first people who looked at birth order actually thought that people wouldn't know their mother's ages perfectly, but they would know how many older brothers and sisters they had. So people started looking at birth order because they thought it was a proxy for maternal age, as one of those cases where, people did the right experiment for the wrong reasons. So it looks like maternal age is not really a factor.
And is that also true if you include, I was just thinking, it's crazy to think that you'd know how many pregnancies your mother had more accurately than her age when she had you, because she might have had stillbirths, she might have had miscarriages. Does that all factor in as well?
We did one study. First place, most people don't know how many miscarriages their mothers have had. I mean, miscarriage is a pretty private matter, and a woman might share it with her husband, but she's unlikely to share it with her children. So in most studies which are done with the actual adult heterosexuals and homosexuals asking about their families, they just don't know about miscarriages. We did one study in which we actually drew blood from the mothers of gay and straight men, and then we asked the mothers about their reproductive histories. And in that case, we did have data on miscarriages. I think we counted, I don't remember honestly, I don't think we counted male miscarriages as male live births for reasons I don't remember, but there aren't many studies that have the data. The only study I really know of that has asked about miscarriages were studies on which I happen to be an author.
So it's something about how the mother's immune system responds the more babies she has. What kind of effect size are we talking? Like, how much more likely are you to be gay if you have lots of older siblings and you're male?
Oh, it's a very small effect. And it's natural that it should be a small effect. Whenever you have any phenomenon that has multiple causes, which I think homosexuality does, as I said before, I think that genes have an impact. I think something to do with hormone levels in utero or the fetus's sensitivity to sex hormones. So I think we have multiple biological effects. So no single one of them is going to have what we call a big effect size, which is usually measured by what proportion of the phenomenon can be explained by this factor. Well, we know from right off that that birth order is not going to account for everything. So, we calculated once that if you look at people who have 2.5 older brothers, about half of them would be that type of birth order gay. But, most people don't have 2.5 older brothers, especially nowadays.
Is there any way of knowing if there are social factors going on there as well? If there's something that is a way in which younger siblings experience the world differently?
Yes. My first postdoctoral student, who was a collaborator with me on a lot of this research, did a very nice study in which he assembled a fairly reasonable sized sample of people who were raised purely with their biological siblings, people who had stepbrothers or, stepbrothers who were in had the relationship of an older brother, but were not never biologically occupied the same uterus as the subject. And he also looked then at people who were adopted out, who had biological older brothers with whom they never lived. And it turned out that what mattered was the number of male fetuses your mother has carried before you, not whether or not you were raised in a home with someone in the social role of an older brother.
And maybe also the number of female fetuses, if the recent data is to be believed. Leading into a big question, I have heard that women are more likely to be lesbians when they have a male twin. So when they have shared a uterus with a male fetus, they have a slightly elevated testosterone and slightly more likely to be gay. Is that right? And relatedly, what do we know in terms of the differences between possible biological causes of male homosexuality and of female homosexuality?
Well, you're asking me a question from the area of behavior genetics, and I'm just not that familiar with it. All I could say categorically is that a lot of those studies were carried out on smallish samples. So, looking at a study that looked at women who were co-twins, had a male co-twin, it might have found in that particular study an elevated prevalence of homosexuality, but I'm going to bet you it wasn't based on 10,000 cases. It was probably based on maybe 100 at the most. So I can't answer specifically to that line of research, but I would just make the general comment that probably is based on a smallish number of cases.
But it might make intuitive sense, I suppose, if testosterone is one of the factors that's affecting female sexual orientation.
Yeah, I don't doubt that testosterone could be a factor. I mean, you have to do some little fancy footwork here, because if you want to start talking about testosterone as a factor in masculinizing the brain, you have to say, well, why is it not masculinizing other aspects of the fetus's body? And there is no evidence that adult lesbian women have have features that look like they were androgenized in utero. People who pursue hormonal explanations say, well, if the hormone levels are elevated this trimester or that trimester or so forth and so on, it's perfectly possible that the brain could be androgenized without showing any signs of androgenization in the female genitals. So that's how they have to explain it. So I don't doubt the hormonal explanation. It could be possible, but it requires more auxiliary hypotheses than might be apparent at first.
When you say androgenized physically, do you just mean in terms of genitals or things also like muscle mass or shoulder width or finger length, all these other more subtle signs?
All of that could be classed under the label of androgenization.
And we don't see more of that in gay women than in straight women.
There have been studies looking at. There have been many studies over. Homosexuality has been a topic of interest for many decades. And unfortunately, in a research area like this, if you go online and are determined to find a study that found lesbian women have broader shoulders, you will undoubtedly find one. So yeah, there could be prior research finding evidence of androgenization in utero, but again, the quality of the evidence has to be taken into account, especially when you're in a topic where a lot of people, for non-scientific reasons, have conclusions they want to reach. And I think you always have to be extra skeptical if you're looking at a research area where the conclusions are important for social and political reasons to various groups. It needs an additional level of skepticism.
All right, with all that borne in mind, should we talk about male homosexuality specifically and the various possible biological things that could be going on? So we know from the birth order effect research that it's not just genetic, but it is partly genetic.
I would go back to the twin studies, and I mean, behavior geneticists have made the argument to me that the twin studies themselves are sufficient to show that homosexuality can't be 100% genetic. If it were 100% genetic, you would have close to 100% agreement. If one twin is homosexual, the other twin is going to be homosexual. In fact, it's more like the odds go from, let's say, 3% that a co-twin will be homosexual in fraternal twins to like 25% in identical twins.
It's not very high. So 3/4 of the cases of identical twins.
No, to 25%. 25%.
But I mean that in 3/4 of cases, there will be a mismatch between
yes.
sexuality with identical twins. That's incredibly high.
Actually, it's pretty typical for twin studies. We're looking at a variety of traits. This is a very typical kind of finding in twin studies.
It surprises me. Okay. Okay. So genetics are important, but there's clearly a lot of other things going on.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I've met some rabid geneticists who seem to me to be objecting to my immunological theory because they see it as a turf issue, or at least that was the feeling I got. But I think reasonable geneticists could just look at the twin data and say, okay, this is not a single gene of large effect, or we will be looking at 100% concordance.
What else might be going on apart from genes and the immunological effect in utero?
Well, you already covered the third traditional hypothesis, which is that there's something about hormonal levels in utero. And as I explained to you before, it's perfectly feasible. There's certainly an enormous amount of animal evidence showing that hormonal levels can affect later behavior in animals. And there is some data from human intersexes who were exposed to abnormal hormone levels. So depending on what conclusion you would personally like to reach, you could look at the data, for example, on females with a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where the adrenal glands, which produce some testosterone in both males and females, are hyperactive in female fetuses, and they produce so much testosterone that the female fetus comes out with genitalia that look like something in between male genitalia and female genitalia. So with these female fetuses that they were exposed to a whacking great amount of testosterone and that it had a big effect, so much so that their genitals are ambiguous. Now, when you look at their sexual orientation, yes, they have elevated rates of uh, lesbian orientation, but by no means is it close to 100%. It looks like the effect is more to make them more masculine in a tomboyish kind of way, less so than specifically affecting their sexual orientation. So it's a cup half full or half empty finding, depending on whether you want to say everything is due to prenatal hormones or whether you want to downplay the effect of prenatal hormones.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And there clearly is a significant social effect. Maybe I'm question begging. We've seen a very large uptick in the last, say, half century in the proportion of people who are identifying as gay or lesbian or bisexual. My understanding is that the biggest uptick has been among women identifying as bisexual, particularly among younger generations. But nevertheless, we've seen a rise across all of these different categories. I suppose there could be biological explanations for it, but the more obvious explanation for that is it's to do with social attitudes having changed so quickly.
Well, I would half agree with you. I agree with you that the recent surge in teenagers claiming that they're bisexual, they're non-binary, blah 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 blah. Clearly, this has a social impact. Now, how many of these females, and it's mostly this surge is like 75% or 80% teenage females, not teenage males. So yeah, there's no question. You got this big new whack of females describing themselves as bisexual. But what happens when the rubber meets the road? How many of these females have actually been having sex with both males and females? How many of them are virgins who are basically sitting in their parents and going on Tumblr or TikTok and developing ideas about what their sexuality might be?
Yeah, there's definitely some social desirability bias going on, right? And particularly among women. It is also the case, I think, that women being genuinely bisexual, so women actually having sexual relationships with both men and women across their lifetimes, it's more common in women than it is in men, right? Like genuine bisexuality in men, at least nowadays, when being gay is much less stigmatized, is quite rare. Is that true?
I would say that, yes, bisexuality is more common in women than in men. Any kind of survey almost always finds that the distribution of sexual orientations for men is a kind of reverse J shape. You have this huge number of heterosexual men, small number of bisexuals, and then you have an uptick at the end of men who describe themselves as homosexual. Whereas with females, it's more of a straight line. You have most heterosexuals, then bisexuals, and then exclusively lesbian women. So there is quite a difference in the prevalence of bisexuality among men and women, with it being more common in women.
Given that, it seems sort of obvious that we should be thinking about male homosexuality and lesbianism as being the same sort of thing with the same sorts of biological roots. But is it possible that it's not, and that actually we should be thinking of them as quite distinct?
I think they have one compelling similarity, which is that in both homosexual men and in lesbian women, in early childhood, you find higher rates of cross-gender behavior. So gay men, there's a strong correlation between homosexuality in adult men and having been a sissy boy. And there's a strong correlation, although not as strong, between being a lesbian woman and having been a tomboy girl. So there is that one similarity, which argues that whatever it is that causes a person to have the typical sexual interests of the opposite sex also causes them to have other interests and behaviors that resemble the opposite sex. So there is that similarity. Now, whether when you go further upstream, you're going to get the same causes, I don't know. It might be that the genes that cause or the genes that predispose to male homosexuality might be quite different from the genes that predispose to female homosexuality. I don't think we know enough yet.
It's a surprising amount that we don't know. We've got the little effects from androgens and the little effect from birth order and the little effect from genes, but it seems like there's quite a big area of uncertainty in terms of what's actually going on here. Do you think that we know enough to roughly affirm the born this way narrative, which is, of course, a political narrative, but do you think there's enough scientific evidence to back that up roughly?
I would say yes, there is enough scientific evidence to back up the born this way viewpoint, but not enough evidence to get too specific about what exactly about the way you were born this way produced this outcome.
This is a more controversial question, but I think it's an important one, even though it will sound odd to some listeners. Should we understand homosexuality, either male or female homosexuality, as a paraphilia or as something different, something in its own category?
There are a couple of different, well, there's probably more than two, but there are two main schools of thought on this, which I would regard as respectable. One view, which is held by a number of my colleagues and friends and people whom I respect, is that homosexuality and paraphilia are qualitatively different entities, that these are different natural kinds, and that you shouldn't be speaking of homosexuality in the same breath as paraphilias because these are unrelated phenomena. That's one school of thought, and it depends on making some pretty strong assumptions about the biological causes or any causes. It makes strong assumptions about the causes of homosexuality versus paraphilia. But it's a respectable point of view. The other point of view to which I personally am closer is that society labels certain non-reproductive sexual interests as bad and others as more or less okay, and society has decided that paraphilias are one thing and homosexuality should not be classed with the paraphilias, but I see that as more of a socio-political distinction than as a distinction where we can really point to a lot of hard empirical evidence.
Okay, so that the distinction is just socially constructed rather than...
Well, to say it's just socially constructed makes it sound like you're deciding, whether you should cut the crust off your cucumber sandwiches. And I think it's, I think objectively speaking, some, let's call them anomalous erotic interests are intrinsically harmful to other people, or are, if not intrinsically harmful, likely to cause harm to other people or harm to the individual themselves. So it's not 100% an arbitrary social distinction, but I think that there certainly are, that there is a social distinction that's being made now. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, people would not have made a distinction between paraphilias like exhibitionism, paedophilia, clinical sadism, and homosexuality. Now we make a very big distinction, but I would say that big distinction is not because we made enormous progress in scientific understandings of the origins of sexual interest, but because the social, political, and moral climate changed and people decided that homosexuality was not causing any harm. Therefore, it's not a disorder.
And Born This Way does not refute the idea. If Born This Way is true, that doesn't mean that you can't defend scientifically the decision to put homosexuality in the same category as paraphilias, because in fact, as I hope we'll get onto, paraphilias also have important biological origins.
Yeah, Born This Way is like a political slogan for a very specific application. As you've just alluded to, one could very easily say pedophiles were born this way. I personally would say that pedophiles were born this way. So born this way is not a get out of jail free card for everything that pertains to sexual minorities. As I said, born this way was applied very specifically to one situation. It does not work as a general guideline for whether we choose to disapprove of a particular sexual behavior, because pedophiles might be born this way. Clinical sadists might be born this way. Lust murderers might be born this way.
Yeah, the main kind of political force behind Born This Way is basically to say that attempts at conversion therapy are not worth it because they don't work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it has other conveniences. If you were born this way, God must have intended you to be born this way. So, it serves a lot of people with slightly different political agendas, but all having in common that they want to make homosexuality more acceptable and to remove barriers to things like marriage for gay people.
My understanding is that there are certain things that correlate with having paraphilias, like, for instance, being left-handed. Are there other markers that we see more often in people with paraphilias than with being male? That's another one. That's a big one, right?
Yeah, the left-handedness, I don't know who did the first research, but I and one of my postdoctoral students did a lot of work on left-handedness, and we found a pretty substantial increase in the rate of left-handedness or non-right-handedness, which would include left-handedness plus something like ambidexterity. And we also found that among pedophiles that pedophiles tended to have lower IQs than sex offenders against adult women. Now, both left-handedness and low IQ are non-specific indicators that something deleterious happened during fetal development. So even if future research absolutely nails it, that without doubt, pedophiles, let's say, have elevated rates of non-right-handedness and lower IQs. That doesn't give you a specific etiology. It just says this is further evidence that whatever is causing pedophilia was prenatal and had to do with perturbations in neurodevelopment.
Do you also see facial asymmetry for the same reason?
It would be. I never personally did research on facial asymmetry, but it would be the same class of explanations, which takes you to the point of saying, look, this suggests a neurodevelopmental perturbation in utero, but it's not a specific explanation. Lots of syndromes have increased levels of non-right-handedness.
Something has gone wrong in our society. We are in an era of accelerating change and uncertainty. Faced with deteriorating health, increasing isolation, broken institutions, and division in society. What's happening and how can we fix it? It's clear we can't just rely on out-of-touch politicians. It's time to challenge conventional wisdom and find the answers elsewhere. Wisdom Rebellion is a thought-provoking podcast that brings the world's leading experts to you, leaving you with practical advice to build a better today and a prosperous tomorrow, one conversation at a time. My name is Kat. I'm a mother, partner, and business owner with a lot more questions than answers. I ask experts how societal changes impact our careers, health, relationships, and children, and try to answer the question, how can we not just survive, but thrive in the modern age? No topics are off limits. Subscribe now so you don't miss a chance for your own Wisdom Rebellion.
Two questions. One, what kind of insults in utero are we talking about here? Like mothers being very unwell, or what are examples of things that might cause these kind of phenomena?
I never looked at it. I suppose you could, if you wanted to, you could look at typical things like maternal drinking during pregnancy, maternal smoking during pregnancy. We know that maternal smoking has some effect on the uterus because of birth weight being lower in children of smoking mothers. So those are the things you look at, but I don't really know if anybody has surveyed the mothers. Maybe they have. I'm an old man. It's been a long time since I was actively researching those areas. But at the time I was working in that area, I don't think there was any. A survey of mothers of, let's say, pedophiles would be really hard to do. In the first place, if you're working in a clinic where you're seeing pedophiles, who would be only a proportion of sex offenders against children, the majority of them don't even admit to being pedophiles. You could get guys who have charged and convicted of sexual offenses against 3 different prepubertal children, and they'll still tell you with a straight face that no, they're really only attracted to adult women, but this happened because I was drunk, I was depressed, I was this or that, I had low self-esteem. So you'd have a hard time pulling your sample of, it's hard to assemble a sample of pedophiles who admit to being pedophiles and who are, let's say, gold-plated subjects. Now, how are you going to get information about their mothers? Nobody's going to go and say, gee, Mom, would you like to be in a study that's for mothers of pedophiles? By the way, I'm a pedophile.
We ask you about how much you drank in pregnancy. Yeah. I assume that all of these studies of pedophiles are people who've been convicted. So also there's going to be that factor. Is there something different about the ones who end up in prison versus the ones who get away with it?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Of course, that's true. The ones who are convicted are probably a bit dumber to start with. I mean, intelligence is a big advantage in all kinds of enterprises, both of good and of evil. So, yeah, I'm sure that it's skewed. There is a group in Germany who were advertising for pedophiles to come in for a kind of prophylactic treatment. They were offering psychological counseling to pedophiles to help them avoid offending in real life. And so that group of people would probably have data on a wider range of subjects. But I haven't looked at the data they're publishing recently. So it could be done, but you would have to have what's your carrot for people coming in and outing themselves as pedophiles? In that case, the carrot was we can provide treatment to help you avoid offending if that is what you want. And a lot of them do want that, to avoid offending. So you would have to have a carrot. You would also have to be able to provide 100% assurance that the government or nobody else could ever get access to that information. I think that's becoming an increasingly difficult claim to make given modern technologies.
So it is possible that all of this stuff with handedness and IQ is actually just an artifact of the people who we end up studying because of who ends up being caught.
It's possible. I did do one study some years ago in which I tried to match subjects roughly. Did I match them on education level or something? And it looked like if you matched them on variables like that, you still got a difference. So I don't think it's 100% going to account for difference in things like handedness.
And do we see the same thing among people with other paraphilias, say ones that are less stigmatized or that are not criminalized?
I don't know what erotic interests besides homosexuality and paedophilia have been examined for handedness.
Well, but I also want to know what's the relationship between homosexuality and handedness. So let's say male homosexuality.
Oh, elevated. A lot of studies have found elevated rates of left-handedness in gay men and even more so in lesbian women.
More so in lesbian women. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Right. Do we know, so it's presumably it's this in utero thing, the slightly mysterious factor?
No, that one could be a genetic, it could be that could be a genetic finding. It could be that whatever gene predisposes to homosexuality also predisposes to a slightly atypical brain organization in a benign direction, which is what left-handedness is. So I wouldn't say, that's possible. That's possibly a genetic finding of some sort.
strong evidence for the Born This Way thesis is that we do see, even if the way that we define homosexuality and lesbianism right now in the contemporary West has its own peculiarities, we do see people having same-sex relationships and people even having exclusive same-sex orientations in different times and places, and including, of course, people also having, to touch on transsexualism, which is another area of your work, homosexual transsexualism is a phenomenon in some cultures where you have men who are sort of demarcated as a third gender and who have exclusively have sexual relationships with men. Could you talk about that a little bit, the examples of this? I think it tends to get a bit misused in the political discourse because these groups are weaponized to make particular points.
There are some cultures, a prime example being a country called, Samoa. Everybody's heard of Samoa. And in the Samoan population, there are biological males called fa'afafina. It's pronounced with a glottal stop, fa'afafina. And the fa'afafina are accepted by the Samoan population. They're not ostracized, and they dress approximately like women, although my understanding is that there are some subtle differences of the clothing that biological female Samoans wear and the clothing that the fa'afafina wear. And they're not alienated from their families or anything. They participate in their families and they contribute towards their nephews and nieces' well-being. But I think they kind of live in fa'afafina communal circumstances. Now, whether or not they're analogous to Western transsexuals is a point of argument. If you ask them, they don't say I'm a woman. They say I'm a fa'afafina, which they see as a third category of being. Now, so does that mean that because they see themselves that way, does that mean they're ideologically unrelated to Western transsexuals? I would argue not. And I also want to point out that we don't know what will happen when the most rural, remote Samoan village is connected enough to the world that everybody there knows about Western transsexualism and sex reassignment surgical procedures. Maybe when the fa'afafina find out that, you can get a vagina, a surgeon can give you one, maybe they will stop thinking of themselves as a third category of human and start to think of themselves as the local equivalents of transsexuals. I don't know. We don't know.
They might become more of a medical category. I read this book many years ago. I forget the author now, but it's a very interesting ethnography of travesti in Brazil, who are sort of like this, but they tend to work in the sex industry and exclusively sell sex to men. And they do some, this ethnography was quite a while ago. It would have been maybe the early 2000s. They did some medical adjustments physically. So they would get silicone injected into their bums and their boobs and kind of give more feminine physique. But something that they have no interest in doing is having their genitals operated on. But it may be that in the travesti case, that's because they make a living by selling sex to men, and actually some men are very interested in having sex specifically with transsexuals. They're not interested in specifically with having sex with people who look physiologically female, except that they have male genitalia. That's a niche. I can't remember. There is a name for this, isn't there? Autoandro something,
which I invented. Gynandromorphophilia.
Right. The common assumption, I think, is that these men are in some way gay, but they're suppressing their gayness, and so they're expressing it in this peculiar way. Is there any truth to that assumption?
I don't believe that. First place, we have to make a kind of distinction among different men who have sex with feminized males, like the fa'afafina in Samoa. And Samoa is, or at least until recently was, a fairly devout Christian country. And biological females were not particularly sexually accessible to heterosexual biological males. So I think that some heterosexual Samoans used the services of Fafita, who, if they kept their clothes on and whatnot, they looked like females, and they probably were mainly getting oral sex or something like that. So in that case, it's a substitute for what the guys really wanted. They weren't going for Fafina because they wanted a hybrid male-female. They were going after Fafina because a Fafina was the closest thing to a female that was realistically available, but certainly at short notice. So we have to make a distinction between those men who are using feminized males as substitute objects versus males who positively want an individual with the body shape of a female except for penis and scrotum. Now, your question was really about those guys who preferentially want an individual who looks like a biological female except for the genitalia. I would say they are basically heterosexual males, not homosexual. Typically, when they're not going after feminized males, their sexual interaction is with physically normal biological females, not with physically normal biological males.
Is it something that we can test with phallometric, or has this been tested?
Yeah, a colleague of mine, Mike Bailey, did some phallometric work. He did publish phallometric work on guys who had a preference for, let's call them she-males. I mean, I realize that's a bad word. And I think his work confirmed what I just said to you, is that their other sexual interest, apart from feminized males, is not masculine males, but normal females.
The closeted gay argument just doesn't seem to hold up.
No, I've never bought that. People try to understand deviant sexualities. They try to understand them in terms of what they felt themselves. I've always felt this is a mistake. If you really are trying to understand some kind of deviant sexuality, I think it's a mistake to keep trying to relate it to something that seems more familiar. You really need to take it for what it is and try and understand it in terms of the people who are doing it. And I think these kind of pop psychology explanations, this is a closeted male who can't accept his homosexuality, I don't buy that.
It's a bit Just So story. This is a surprisingly popular, I don't know, maybe it's not surprising. This is quite a popular genre of porn, right? The she-male porn. I know that it's arguably a pejorative term, but it does seem as if either quite a lot of heterosexual men are interested in this, or a smaller minority are very, very, very interested in this and seek out a lot of pornographic content.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. My guess would be that it's probably that more heterosexual men have a slight interest in she-males than we have previously known. That would be my guess. I don't think that a tiny minority of men are accounting for gigantic amounts of she-male pornography.
I heard once, although I forget the researcher who suggested this, that there might be a sort of optical illusion going on where heterosexual men are aroused obviously by the female physique. They're also aroused by just the sight of an erect penis, and having those on the same person has a sort of super stimulus effect. Have you come across that notion?
No, and I don't know if it's true. There are differences among men who are attracted. We keep using she-males because it's convenient, so I'm going to keep using it. Mm-hmm. Also because I'm tired of the euphemism treadmill. But I have interviewed some men who were sexually attracted to she-males, and they're not all the same. Some of them want to see an erect penis along with a female physique because that is kind of the ultimate confirmation that this is the thing they're going for. Some of them don't want to see the penis. They just want to know that it's there or that it was there, and it becomes more conceptual. But as far as actually seeing the penis, no, that can stay covered up. But I want to know that this individual in some way is a male. So it's hard to generalize about what exactly do they want, because this is not a monolithic population. They differ in what they want to see and what is most arousing to them.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.